The silence of power. The grandfather clock struck midnight. Alessandro Moretti stood alone by the window of his grand mansion, watching the rain trace lonely rivers down the glass. Behind him, an empty dining table stretched across the room. 12 chairs, 12 place settings, and not a single guest. Today he turned 55 years old. And no one remembered. Not his lieutenants. Not his lawyers. Not the men who kissed his ring and swore eternal loyalty. Not even his own brother, who owed him his life 3 times over. Alessandro lifted his glass of whiskey, watching the amber liquid catch the light of the crystal chandelier. He had spent 40 years building an empire. He controlled half the city's ports. Politicians whispered his name with reverence and fear. Judges adjusted their rulings when his lawyers entered the courtroom. He was the most powerful man most people would never meet. And tonight he was the loneliest. "Is this what you wanted, Papa?" he whispered to the darkness. "Is this what power feels like?" His father had died in his arms 32 years ago, bleeding out on the floor of a warehouse, the victim of a rival family's ambition. Alessandro had been 23 then, young, hungry, and burning with rage. "Make them fear you," his father had gasped with his final breath. "Fear is the only currency that never loses value." Alessandro had listened. He had built his empire on fear, on ruthlessness, on the simple understanding that weakness was death. He had eliminated his enemies. He had rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal with equal precision. And now, standing in his mansion that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, he realized something terrible. Fear had made him powerful, but fear had also made him utterly alone. The weight of darkness. The rain intensified outside. Alessandro walked through the empty halls of his home, his footsteps echoing against marble floors that had been polished by hands he never bothered to notice. Paintings worth millions lined the walls, masterpieces that stared back at him with indifferent eyes. He stopped in front of a photograph he kept hidden in his study, the only photograph he allowed himself to keep. A woman with dark hair and gentle eyes smiled at the camera, her arms wrapped around a small boy with serious features. His mother, and himself at age 7. She had died when he was 8. Cancer had taken her slowly, painfully, while his father worked the streets and built the foundation of what would become the Moretti Empire. Alessandro remembered holding her hand in the hospital, watching her grow weaker each day. "Promise me something, my little Alessandro," she had whispered near the end. "Promise me you'll always have kindness in your heart. The world will try to take it from you. Don't let it." He had promised, and he had broken that promise 1,000 times over. Alessandro set down his whiskey glass and walked to the window again. The mansion employed 37 staff members, cooks, cleaners, gardeners, security personnel. They all knew what day it was. The calendar in the kitchen had the date circled. But none of them would dare approach him with something as personal as birthday wishes. He had made certain of that. He had built walls so high that even kindness couldn't climb them. Suddenly, a soft knock came at the door of his study. Alessandro frowned. It was past midnight. The staff had been dismissed hours ago. Only the night security remained, and they knew better than to disturb him. "Enter," he said, his voice flat. The door opened slowly, and Alessandro's frown deepened. It was Elena, the cleaning woman who worked the evening shifts. She was small, with tired eyes and hands rough from years of labor. Behind her, 2 small faces peeked around her worn coat. "Children." Alessandro straightened. What is this? Elena's face flushed with embarrassment. She clutched something in her hands. A small box that looked homemade, wrapped in newspaper and tied with red yarn. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "The night guard, Mr. Romano, he let us in. I know I shouldn't be here, but what?" Alessandro's voice was ice. The smaller child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5, stepped forward suddenly, breaking free from her mother's grip. She wore a dress that had been mended too many times, and her shoes had holes in them, but her smile was radiant. "Happy birthday, Mr. Boss," she announced, holding up a card made from construction paper. Glitter fell from it like tiny stars. Alessandro stared. The boy, perhaps 7 years old, stepped forward more cautiously. He had his mother's serious eyes. "We made you a cake, sir. Mama said it's your birthday and nobody came to your party. So we came instead." Elena's face had gone pale. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll take them home immediately. I never should have." "Wait." The single word stopped Elena mid-turn. Alessandro walked slowly toward the children, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. The little girl didn't flinch. She simply held up her card higher, waiting. He took it. The card was simple: a crayon drawing of a house, a sun, and stick figures with smiling faces. Inside, written in wobbly handwriting, were the words, "Happy birthday to the big boss. We hope you have a good day. Love, Sophia and Marco." Love. When was the last time someone had written that word to him? Alessandro looked at the box Elena held. "What is this?" "A cake, sir," Elena whispered. "It's not much. Just vanilla with chocolate frosting. Sophia insisted on helping, so it's a bit lopsided. I understand if you don't. You baked me a cake. It wasn't a question." Elena nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. Alessandro took the box and opened it. Inside was a small round cake, barely bigger than his hand. The frosting was uneven, and someone had written "Happy BDAY" in shaky letters. A single candle, clearly used before, with melted wax dripping down its side, stood crookedly in the center. It was, without question, the ugliest cake Alessandro had ever seen. It was also the most beautiful. The light in the darkness. "Sit down," Alessandro said. Elena's eyes widened. "Sir, all 3 of you, sit down." He gestured to the chairs by the fireplace, chairs that cost more than Elena earned in a year. She hesitated, looking at her children's worn clothes, clearly worried about dirtying the expensive fabric. "Please," Alessandro added, and his voice softened in a way it hadn't in decades. They sat. Alessandro placed the cake on the small table between them and sank into the chair across from the family. The fire crackled, casting warm shadows across the room. "Why did you do this?" he asked. Sophia answered before her mother could speak. "Because being alone on your birthday is the saddest thing in the whole world," she said matter-of-factly. "When Papa died, Mama cried on her birthday because nobody brought her flowers. So Marco and I picked dandelions from the park and made her a crown." Alessandro looked at Elena. "Your husband?" "He passed 2 years ago," Elena said quietly. "An accident at the factory. There was no compensation, no insurance. I had to find work quickly, and your house was hiring." She paused. "You've kept us alive, sir, even if you didn't know it." The words hit Alessandro harder than any blow he had ever received. For 2 years, this woman had cleaned his floors, washed his windows, and scrubbed his toilets. invisible to him, nothing more than a line item on his accountant's spreadsheet. And all that time, she had been raising 2 children alone, surviving on the wages he paid without thinking. "How did you know it was my birthday?" he asked. "Mrs. Caruso in the kitchen," Elena said. "She mentioned it yesterday. She said nobody ever celebrates with you." She hesitated. "I thought that sounded lonely." Marco spoke up. "Are you really a bad man like the other staff whisper about?" "Marco!" Elena gasped, but Alessandro held up his hand. He looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw something familiar in those serious eyes. The weight of responsibility too young. The protective instinct toward his mother and sister. "Yes," Alessandro answered honestly. "I've done bad things. Many bad things." Marco considered this. "Do you feel sorry about them?" The question hung in the air. Alessandro thought about the men he had destroyed, the families he had torn apart, the lives he had ended or ruined in his climb to the top. He thought about the choices he had made and the man he had become. "I didn't used to," he said finally. "But tonight I'm not sure anymore." Sophia slid off her chair and walked to Alessandro. Before anyone could stop her, she climbed onto his lap. This man who made grown men tremble, and wrapped her small arms around his neck. "It's okay to be sorry," she whispered. "Mama says sorry is the first step to being better." Alessandro sat frozen. He couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him. His body had forgotten how to receive affection. His arms hung uselessly at his sides while this tiny girl, who had no reason to trust him, offered him comfort he didn't deserve. Slowly, carefully, as if handling something precious and fragile, Alessandro raised his arms and hugged her back. And for the first time in 40 years, Don Alessandro Moretti, the most feared man in the city, felt tears on his cheeks. The cost of change. The months that followed transformed Alessandro in ways he never expected. He began noticing his staff, learning their names, asking about their families, ensuring their wages were fair. He established a fund for employees' children's education. He quietly paid off Elena's remaining debts from her husband's medical bills. He ate dinner with Elena and her children every Sunday. First, it was awkward. Alessandro didn't know how to have conversations that didn't involve business or threats. But Sophia chattered enough for everyone, and Marco gradually warmed to him, asking questions about the books in his library and the ships in his ports. Elena watched these changes with cautious hope. She saw the man beneath the reputation. A man who had armored his heart against pain and forgotten that the armor also kept out love. "You're different," she told him one evening, after the children had fallen asleep on his couch. "Everyone notices. Is that a problem?" Elena smiled gently. "For some people, I think it might be." She was right. The change in Alessandro did not go unnoticed by his associates. A Don who showed softness was a Don who showed weakness. The whispers began, quiet at first, then louder. His brother, Vincenzo, confronted him in his study on a gray Tuesday afternoon. "What are you doing, Alessandro?" Vincenzo demanded. "Playing house with a cleaning woman and her brats? Watch your words. Watch my words." Vincenzo laughed bitterly. "You've gone soft. The Ricci family is moving into the eastern ports because they smell blood in the water. Your blood." Alessandro remained calm. "Let them try. This isn't about trying. This is about perception. You've spent 40 years making men fear you, and now you're throwing it away for what? Pretty face? Children that aren't even yours." They're more family to me than you've ever been. The words cut deep. Vincenzo's face twisted with anger and hurt. You forget who stood beside you when Papa died, Vincenzo said coldly. You forget who helped you build all of this. And now you discard me for strangers. I'm not discarding anyone. I'm simply choosing to live differently. Vincenzo stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Then choose carefully, brother, because there are people who won't let you change. People who need you to stay exactly as you are. He left without another word. That night, Alessandro sat with Elena on his terrace, watching the city lights flicker below. Your brother doesn't approve of us, Elena said. It wasn't a question. My brother sees change as a threat. Is it? A threat? Alessandro was quiet for a long moment. I've lived my entire life following rules I didn't choose. Fear others before they fear you. Trust no one. Never show weakness. He looked at her. Your children taught me something in one night that I spent 55 years failing to learn. What's that? That kindness isn't weakness. It's courage. And that maybe, it's not too late to become someone different. Elena reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were rough from work, but her touch was gentle. It's never too late, she said. Blood and betrayal. The phone call came at 3 a.m. 3 weeks later. Alessandro answered to hear his most trusted lieutenant, Carmine, speaking in urgent tones. They've taken them, boss. The woman and her children. Vincenzo gave them up. The world stopped. Where? The old warehouse on Harbor Street. The Ricci family. They're using them as leverage. They want the eastern ports and they want you to step down. Alessandro dressed in silence, his movements mechanical. Fear clawed at his chest. Not for himself, but for Elena, for Sofia, for Marco. 3 innocent lives, caught in the violence of his world. He had sworn to protect them. He had promised himself that his love wouldn't destroy them. And now his own brother had proven that promise worthless. The warehouse was cold when Alessandro arrived. He came alone as they had demanded. His men waited 3 blocks away, ready to move if he gave the signal. Inside, Elena sat bound to a chair, her face bruised but defiant. Marco stood in front of his mother, small fists clenched, trying to shield her with his body. Sofia was crying softly in the corner, held by one of Ricci's men. And there was Vincenzo standing beside Enzo Ricci, the head of the rival family. Brother, Vincenzo said, the word dripping with contempt. How nice of you to join us. Let them go, Alessandro said. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled at his sides. This is between us. They have nothing to do with our business. Enzo Ricci laughed, a cruel, empty sound. But that's exactly the point, isn't it? You care about them. The great Don Moretti, brought low by a cleaning woman and her puppies. What do you want? Everything. Ricci spread his arms wide. The ports, the routes, your seat at the table. You'll sign everything over, and in return, we'll let them live. Alessandro looked at Elena. She shook her head slightly, her eyes fierce despite her fear. Don't do it, her gaze said. Don't give up everything for us. But he would. He already knew he would. And my brother? Alessandro asked, his eyes never leaving Vincenzo. What did you promise him? Vincenzo stepped forward. What was always mine. What you stole from me by being born first. The empire, the respect, the power, it should have been mine. You would sell your own blood for power? You sold your soul for it years ago. Don't pretend we're different. Alessandro absorbed the blow. His brother was right in a way. He had done terrible things. He had been ruthless and cold and merciless. But he was trying to change. And he refused to let that change cost these 3 lives. Fine, he said. Elena gasped. Alessandro, no. I'll sign whatever you want. All of it. The ports, the businesses, everything. In exchange, you let them walk out of here unharmed. And you never touch them again. Ricci smiled. A wise decision. But there's a condition. You're not in a position to make conditions. Alessandro smiled. A cold, terrible smile that reminded everyone in the room exactly who they were dealing with. My men have surrounded this building. Your men outside are already neutralized. If I don't walk out of here with this family, no one walks out of here at all. Ricci's smile faltered. You're bluffing. I never bluff. You know that. The silence stretched. Alessandro could see the calculations happening behind Ricci's eyes. The risk assessment. The cost-benefit analysis of calling his bluff. Finally, Ricci nodded to his men. Let them go. Sofia was released. She ran to Alessandro and wrapped herself around his leg. Marco helped his mother stand, his jaw tight with barely controlled rage. Elena looked at Alessandro, tears streaming down her face. You're giving up everything. No, he said softly. I'm finally choosing what matters. He guided them toward the door, keeping his body between them and the guns behind him. His men materialized from the shadows outside, surrounding the family with protection. At the doorway, Alessandro turned back to look at his brother. Goodbye, Vincenzo. It was not a threat. It was not a promise of revenge. It was simply a farewell. Final, heavy, and heartbroken. Vincenzo said nothing, but for just a moment, Alessandro thought he saw regret flicker across his brother's face. Then the door closed, and that life was behind him. A new beginning. The house by the sea was small, a fraction of the mansion he had left behind. Alessandro bought it with the money he had hidden away over the years, money that wasn't tied to his empire or his businesses. It was enough to live comfortably, but not lavishly. Enough to give Elena and the children a safe, quiet life. He signed away his empire without ceremony. The lawyers were baffled. The other families were suspicious. But eventually, they accepted that Don Moretti was truly gone. In his place stood simply Alessandro, a man learning to cook breakfast, to help with homework, to build sandcastles on the beach. I don't understand, Elena said one evening, as they watched Sofia and Marco chase waves in the fading sunlight. You had everything. Power, money, respect. How can you be happy with this? Alessandro turned to look at her. The wind caught her hair, and the sunset painted gold across her face. I had things, he said, possessions, fear dressed up as respect. But I didn't have anyone who would bring me a homemade cake at midnight just because they thought I was lonely. He took her hand. Your children taught me that I was starving for something money couldn't buy. You showed me that I was worthy of kindness even when I didn't deserve it. He paused. For the first time in my life, I have a family. A real one. That's worth more than every port in the world. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. You know they already consider you their father. I know. His voice was thick. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve them. Marco ran up to them, out of breath and grinning. Alessandro. Sofia found a starfish. Come look. Alessandro smiled. A real smile, one that reached his eyes, and allowed Marco to drag him down to the water's edge. The birthday. 1 year later, on a warm September evening, Alessandro came home to find the small house decorated with streamers and balloons. A banner hung across the doorway, painted in Sophia's distinctive style, "Happy Birthday, Pap." He stood frozen in the doorway. Papa. She had never called him that before. Elena appeared from the kitchen, a cake in her hands. Lopsided, messily frosted, beautiful. Sophia insisted on making it herself, she said, smiling. Marco helped with the spelling this time. Behind her, the two children emerged, wearing party hats and enormous grins. "Happy birthday, Papa!" they shouted in unison. Alessandro knelt down and opened his arms, and they crashed into him. Sophia climbing up his chest like a monkey, Marco hanging onto his side. Elena set down the cake and joined the embrace, wrapping her arms around all of them. And there, in that small house by the sea, surrounded by the only family he would ever need, Alessandro Moretti celebrated his 56th birthday. Not with power, not with fear, but with love. Messy, imperfect, lopsided, and more precious than anything he had ever owned. The grandfather clock he had brought from the mansion struck midnight. But this time, Alessandro wasn't counting the hours alone. This time, Sophia was asleep on his lap. Marco was reading beside him on the couch, and Elena's head rested on his shoulder, her breathing soft and peaceful. Outside, the sea whispered against the shore. Inside, a single candle still burned on the remnants of the birthday cake. Alessandro looked around at his life, simple, small, and overflowing with meaning, and thought of his mother's words from so long ago. "Promise me you'll always have kindness in your heart. The world will try to take it from you. Don't let it." "I'm sorry it took so long, Mama," he whispered into the darkness. "But I finally kept my promise." The candle flickered, and Alessandro Moretti, once the most feared man in the city, closed his eyes in perfect peace.